Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon awed watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me. To me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I'm strangely content and cling desperately to those old memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower, which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of somebody mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me there was nothing grotesque in the bones and the skeletons that strewed some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and I thought them more natural than the coloured pictures which I found in many of the mouldy books. From such books I learnt all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all of those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of my youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat, and under the dark, mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and I would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forests. Just once, I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so I ran frantically back, lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So, through endless twilights, I and waited, until, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so restless that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower, reaching above the forest into the unknown outer sky, and at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding the day. In the dank twilight I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs until I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter I clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dread, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, deserted, sinister with the cataracts of startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner. I shivered. I wondered why I did not reach the light. I would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly I groped with one hand for a window that I might peer out and above and try to judge the height that I'd attained. After an infinity of sightless crawling up that concave, desperate precipice, all at once I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew that I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of upper floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand, finding it stone and immovable. I made a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I moved upward again, pushing the trapdoor with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the opening led to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. This was no doubt the floor of some observation chamber. I crawled through carefully, but failed to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, and hoped, when necessary, to be able to pry it up again. I dragged myself from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and the stars of which I'd read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all I found were vast shelves of marble bearing oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I wondered at the hoary secrets abiding in this high apartment, so far cut off from the castle below. Then my hands came upon a doorway, rough with strange chiselling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I dragged it open, and as I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known. For shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron down a short stone passageway of steps was the radiant full moon. I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden clouding of the moon caused me to stumble. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I found unlocked, but did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height of the castle tower. And then the moon came out. The most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and the grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had undergone could compare with what I now saw. The sight was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me through the grating nothing less than solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. I stumbled out upon a white gravel path. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held that frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but I was now determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was or what my surroundings might be, but I continued to stumble along under an arch and out of that region of slabs and columns. I wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten highway. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park. I saw that the moat was filled in and that some of the towers were demolished, whilst new wings had been added here and there, but what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth the sound of gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in, and I saw a dressed company making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, passing, as I did so, from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamour and panic, several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in the race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment, alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what must be lurking near me, unseen. The room seemed deserted, but I thought I detected a presence in one of the alcoves. A hint of motion beyond a golden arched doorway leading to another room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then I beheld, in full, frightful vividness, the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had, by its symbol appearance, changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and dissolution, the putrid, dripping image of unwholesome revolution, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty of the human shape. My eyes were bewitched by its glassy orbs, which stared loathsomely into them and refused to close. Though mine were mercifully blurred, and showed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight. As I did so, I became agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous, hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Throwing out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, in one cataclysmic second of nightmarishness, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I know that I am an outsider, a stranger to this century and men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination. Since I stretched out my fingers and touched the cold, unyielding surface of a mirror.